I humbly come before you today because I'm not a historian, a professional historian. I've just kind of become one to some extent through my interest in genealogy. When I'm doing a research project for anyone, I always want to know, one of the first questions I ask is, why did they migrate? And it's usually something pretty awful, a flood, a famine, a war. And it's something really tragic because it's never, ever easy to leave the place where you grew up and where the rest of your family is. It's always a disaster when somebody has to go. It's rarely, in my grandmother's case, it wasn't a disaster, but she had been an orphan and her grandfather died, and he was the one that was raising her. And her brother had already migrated to the United States, so she came here. And that was in 1920. So, you know, it's always something that's making you move. Well, in 2018, my parents died 5 weeks apart and wound up having a celebration of life service for them. And at this celebration of life, the one person that I could remember from our youth that was such really a close friend of theirs was living in the village, and I contacted her and she came. And we were talking about old people I had known growing up. And a man that I always called Uncle Dave, who wasn't really a biological relative, I said to her, I heard he had passed away a few years ago, and she said, yes, I went to the funeral. And I was a little surprised to find out that he was actually Jewish. And I said, Dave Murray, Jewish? That's not a Jewish name ordinarily, it's an Irish name. And I knew the children well. They were like cousins to me that Dave and his wife Gloria had. And they were raised as Roman Catholics. So I listened to her story and I said, well, how? And she said, well, I know that they changed a convent in France, she said, had changed his documents for his father and the children and his wife, and gave them false marriage certificates and baptismal certificates for the children when they came. And she said, Dave didn't remember very much about France because he was a toddler when he came. He just had, the memories that he had were things basically that people had told him as he grew up. So a couple months after my parents' funeral, I started thinking, well, if I'm going to repeat the story, I need to look into it as much as I can. And as it turned out, I found them in the 1940 and 1930 census. And what really surprised me was they actually had come in 1928. And they were not saying that they were Jewish, but that they had come from Alsace-Lorraine. And I thought about 1928 in the United States. I don't know if you realize our first immigration laws were passed in 1917. There was a law passed that you couldn't get into this country from another country. You couldn't come unless you could pass a reading and writing test. And that was kind of a backlash, that law passed in 1917, against the many Italians that had come in the early part of the 1900s from very poor regions in Italy, where there was no schooling whatsoever. And a remarkable number of those people, if you look in the 1910 census, Italians, especially in the New York metropolitan area, could not read and write, as opposed to other countries. So it was sort of a way to keep the Italians out, that 1917 law. And then in 1925, another immigration law was passed where you couldn't get into the United States unless it was a quota system, basically, based on the 1890 census of the U.S. It was percentages of a very small percentage, something like 2%, of the people that were living here in 1890. Only that many people could be coming in. And that seemed to be actually almost an anti-Jewish rule more than anything, because there were very few people that were Jewish in the 1890 census. So it was sort of not a good news thing on our part that we had that law. And so I knew if you came in 1928, you weren't going to get into the country easily. So I didn't come to the point where I proved that Dave was actually Jewish, but I did come to the conclusion that he had to leave Alsace-Lorraine in 1928 in a hurry. And I knew that I couldn't, if they were false documents, I wasn't going to get anything as a genealogist that could back up the story. So but I did become very curious about what was happening in Alsace-Lorraine in 1928. And to tell you the honest truth, so much was bad in Alsace-Lorraine in 1928 that you almost didn't have to be Jewish to leave. Also, things were developing in Germany in terms of fascism, where they were counting back 7 generations to see if you had anyone in your ancestry that was Jewish. Now, as a genealogist, I find that kind of interesting because most people in this room could not count back 7 generations unless you bothered to do the research. But they would, they had all crazy ways of trying to figure out. So if you were at risk, even if you had an ancestor that was Jewish at that point, and it was really declared a total risk by 1935. So that led me to this, and I will, with that, I'm going to start talking about, oops, mic. To start with, basically, the Treaty of Versailles. Dittmar did a wonderful, Dittmar George, 2 weeks ago. Raise your hand if you were at that talk. Oh, that's going to be really helpful. Did a wonderful job of describing the causes of World War I. And he mentioned the war guilt clause, which placed a total blame on Germany, and how this really has been kind of debunked over time by most historians. The interesting thing is, Dittmar also mentioned that there were 2 American diplomats that were also legally trained. That they were lower-level members of the U.S. delegation at the Treaty of Versailles, and they wrote Clause 231, which is the beginning of the reparations section of the Treaty of Versailles. I won't go into that great detail, but they wrote it using the word responsibility in English. Well, there's not a lot, when it was translated into German and most other languages, it got a slightly different connotation. But there's not much, when you're talking about war and responsibility and war and guilt, I think you're really parsing the words a bit to see a difference. So Germany basically was blamed for the whole thing. And Germany, because of that, had a diminished German military. Supposedly that was one of the things that were going to be required. But the thing that really was bad, Germany was responsible for massive reparations payments for all of the loans that basic countries had taken out in order to go to war. And I've read different figures about this, but basically it would be about $5 billion in US dollars today that they were told they needed to repay. Everyone in the world at the time thought that was going to be impossible to repay that. And it was impossible. Occupation forces basically from France and other places were sent to be in Germany, in the Rhineland, and occupy them. The Germans lost territory. They lost Alsace-Lorraine. The Kaiser and other leaders were to be tried for war crimes. Now, that actually never happened. The Kaiser abdicated, and then he fled to the Netherlands, where Queen Wilhelmina was very happy to have him and protect him. And he died in a palace in the Netherlands. They also, through this, wanted to disarm Germany. But as you'll see in most of the photos that I discovered online while I was researching this, there are plenty of arms floating around and lots of things happening in Germany. They didn't do too well on the disarmament part of it, that's for sure. And then the League of Nations would be formed. This was our President Wilson's little baby. He had 14 points of light that he wanted to incorporate into this treaty and form the League of Nations in order to have peace in the world. And he didn't really have a lot of support from the rest of the Council of Four. This is the Council of Four. Vittorio Orlando, he was from Italy. Lloyd George, England. Woodrow Wilson, United States. And George Clemenceau from France. So, focusing on Wilson and the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, he wanted basically, let me see here, he wanted freedom of navigation. He wanted the Dardan Straits to be always open. Before that, it was a little tricky situation. He wanted to stop having these private treaties that people would, different countries would do, these private little pacts where they would all join together and go to war if someone was attacked and things like that. He wanted those eliminated. He wanted equality of trade conditions. He wanted basically all national armaments across the board to be reduced. He wanted adjustments to all colonial claims such that the people that had been colonized and the people that were colonizing them would all get on the same page and everything would be hunky-dory and wonderful. I can go on and on a little bit about here. He wanted to have all territories restored to their original place, which I don't know how you could figure that out at that point. The map in Europe had changed so many times. But all of this is called Wilsonian idealism. And he was extremely idealistic. And while the treaty was being formed, he really never consulted our own Congress. And they weren't very thrilled with this Treaty of Versailles and never really went along with it and worked against us ever being a part of the Treaty of Versailles because it would be giving up all kinds of sovereignty for us. Okay, back to Vittorio Orlando. He's from Italy, and there had been a secret pact in London in 1915 between Russia, France, and England, and Italy, that they would all work together. They were starting to get worried about Germany even then in 1915. Before World War I started, really, they gang together in 1915 and made this pact. And Vittorio was promised that Italy would get certain territories if they helped, if there were ever a war. So World War I comes to an end, and that part of the bargain never got held up. Just about everything that Vittorio wanted out of that Versailles Treaty didn't happen. So the Italians were furious, and that probably led to the rise of Mussolini. All of that decision to kind of ignore Orlando's requests. Another thing that Orlando had, he wanted, there were many countries involved. These are the Council of Four, basically, the big powers. Japan had suggested that there should be an equality clause in the treaty. And Vittorio wanted that because the Italians at that point in time were really going through grief trying to get into the United States all of a sudden. And he really wanted that, and they wouldn't go along with it. For one, Lloyd George couldn't go along with it because there was a law passed, the white I forget the name of it. Anyway, there was a law passed in Australia in 1901 where they were restricting any immigration from people that were Asian or darker skin. They had to be white. So he was not in a position to be supporting an equality clause. And Woodrow Wilson was not in a position to support an equality course. In fact, Woodrow Wilson was born in the South and in Virginia just before the Civil War and raised in the South. And he really did many good things as a president, He was an idealist and really accomplished some good things along the way. But he had a little issue about women's suffrage, but also about the integration of black people into the government. And he's famous for segregating the bureaucracy, our federal bureaucracy. So he wasn't in a mental state to go along with any kind of inequality clause either. And George Clemenceau also was not in a position, just through the word, I'm going to run out of time, but they all just couldn't go along with that. So Lloyd George basically wanted, I don't want to leave anything out here. He wanted certain things out of this, but mostly he wanted revenge, basically. And revenge never works very well in any relationship, and it's certainly not going to work well between countries. He wanted to blame Germany for everything. He was really quite vocal on that. And he wanted to ensure peace. And his way of ensuring peace was to restrict armaments, which they weren't very successful at. He opposed the racial equality clause because of, it was called the White Australia policy of 1901, now that I look at my notes. And he did gain a lot of territory. They wanted to gain some territory, and when they split up the Ottoman Empire, which Dittmar talked about a lot a couple weeks ago, they got a lot of territory, which would now include the Palestine and Israel, where we're in conflict again. So that was basically what he wanted out of it. I already talked about Victoria, and then Clemenceau. Excuse me. Clemenceau was kind of an interesting guy. He was kind of all over the map in his politics. He was not anti-Semitic. That's one good thing we can say about him. He did lean a little bit towards the Communist Party in the beginning of his career, but became a little more center-oriented as time went on. And he actually got into real trouble early in his career and had to move to the United States. And he was teaching horseback riding lessons in Connecticut, and met his wife there, and they had a couple of children, and they went back to France. And he was a real womanizer and had many mistresses. And that was just the way it was for them in this relationship. Eventually she had a little affair on the side, and he discovered it. He immediately divorced her, sent her back to the United States, and kept the children, and disowned her and stripped her of her French citizenship. What a guy. And so he opposed women's suffrage. He wanted to get Alsace-Lorraine back. He was what's called a revanchist. He wanted Alsace-Lorraine territory to be returned to France. So that was basically his main goal for him. There was a guy named Ferdinand Focht who right away said something that was rather clairvoyant. He'd been a general in the war, and he said he advocated for peace terms that would make it impossible for Germany to wage war again. He felt that the Treaty of Versailles was merely an armistice that would last for about 20 years, and that's about the way it went. And he'd been Supreme Allied Commander at the Western Front. He looked at the Versailles Treaty as a treaty that solved absolutely nothing. He felt that all the problems that had been there before World War I were still there, and they hadn't solved anything. And I had a history professor in college who really felt strongly about that. My history professor said, basically, the one good thing you could say was that the aristocracy kind of got put aside. Most of the empires fell apart, and these big empires disintegrated. But the nationalism that was underlying was still there, and all the other issues were still there. So really not much was solved. And this treaty made the Weimar Republic the next thing that comes into being for Germany. And they had problems from the start because they had no money and lots of bills and all this $5 billion in reparations that they had to come up with. And the country went into an economic downward spiral. I just remembered a cartoon that I saw in a history book in elementary school with a wheelbarrow full of money in order to purchase things. Some of you may remember that. It was impossible. And that inflation went on and on for quite a while. But about 1924, it stabilized, basically because of a thing called the Dawes Act, where banks in the United States lent money to Germany so that they could then pay England and France and everybody else they were indebted to. And it was just a paper floating around and meeting these obligations. But again, in 1929, the economy began to slide again. That's when the Great Depression hits the United States. And then, they were also having lots of internal political issues going on in Germany. The Berlin Spartacist uprising of January 1919 was basically a communist uprising. There was a lot of sympathy to the communists at that point in Germany on one side, and you'll find fascism totally on the other side. But basically, it was an uprising of what was called the Social Democratic Party, and they were really the Communist Party of Germany. And they wanted to nationalize property, strip power from the military, establish a dictatorship. And they were defeated and executed. So basically, Weimar Republic is dealing with no money, lots of bills, and these uprisings. At the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, which will later become what we would call fascists, there were people worried about the communists. After all, Tsar Nicholas and his family had been assassinated in Russia. Things were happening there. Things were happening all over the place. They were worried about the Russians' influence on Germany and invasion from Russia. And so actually France and the United States sort of turned a blind eye, and England, to the what was called the Freikorps. These were paramilitaries, something like our Proud Boys and things like that, that had plenty of arms, it seems. And they appealed to the German middle class, which was suffering terribly, as Dietmar George mentioned a couple weeks ago. Basically, the economy was awful, everything was awful. And so they were looking for an answer. And they turned to this. And this is where you might have heard the term brown shirts. The swastika appeared at this time. The Hitler salute. Hitler's nowhere in the scene yet, but the Hitler salute originated with these people called the Freikorps. And they were anti-communists who opposed liberalism and compromise and really advocated that violence was the only way to solve any problem. So along comes a guy named Anton Drexler, and he forms what's called the German Workers' Party in Munich. That word workers is a little misleading. I didn't really feel like he was supporting workers so much as the middle class who were more well off. There wasn't a lot of feeling on his part for the people that were really down and out and doing the grunt work that ran the economy. He was extremely, spelling typo error there. Semitic should be Semitic. He was quite anti-Semitic. He was an anti-Marxist, and he was a nationalist and a member of the middle class. So he starts his party. But Hitler decides, just shortly thereafter, to take all these people that he'd rounded up for that party and form his own party. This is when we first started hearing about Hitler. And he announced the formation of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which we now refer to as the Nazi Party. And in his speech, he advocated the abandonment of the Treaty of Versailles, the expansion of German territory, and included, I have these, anyway, lots of anti-Semitic rhetoric. Meanwhile, this is apart from Hitler. Some people, I had a little confusion in my mind. He was really anti-Hitler, the man that wrote this book. He was Arthur Moeller van den Broek. And he thought that Hitler was just not worth much. I was trying to figure out a nice way to say it. He was an admirer of Benito Mussolini, who was coming to power by this time in 1923, and he advocated for the inclusion of Austria and Alsace-Lorraine in an empire of German-speaking people. He wanted to reunite all of the German-speaking people into a Third Reich. He praised Prussian socialism because it had supported the monarchy and the church. Now, this idea of supporting a monarchy really hasn't gone away. You may have read recently in the news about this thing called the Reichsbürger movement in Germany. There's a trial going on now for a conspiracy that was discovered 2 years ago when the people were arrested. And it was Prince Heinrich XIII of Rus was going to be the new leader of Germany if they had pulled this off. And it really wasn't a very big band of people, and how they thought they were going to pull this off, I don't know, but they got caught, and there's now a trial going on. And it's called the Reichsbürger movement. They want to return the monarchy to Germany. So, a little bit off-center, those people. Anyway, what van den Broek envisioned was that if you accomplished all of this, and you got all the German-speaking people together, you would have peace and harmony with all the classes, and everybody would know their place and do the right thing, and everything would be just wonderful. So in 1923, that same year, Hitler wanted to take over, with violence and the help of the Freikorps type people, the Bavarian parliament. And it was called the Bierwall Putsch of 1923. And it was Hitler-led and failed an attempt to take over the Bavarian state government. So Hitler wound up in prison over that. And that's when he wrote Mein Kampf. And he determined, while he had a year in prison to think about it, that violence wasn't going to be the way to achieve his goals. And that he would overthrow the state. Overthrowing with violence was kind of unproductive, and he decided to work within the system. And he really did, masterfully, ease into the system. It was kind of going on around people, and they weren't really grasping it unless they were paying attention, real close attention, as to what was going on. And he determined that the state could best be controlled and he could take over by modifying and monitoring its activities very slowly. And he gave himself 5 years to pull this off. He thought, I'll be on top again. That was his thought while he was in prison. And upon release, Hitler soon discovered that Germany was in a slightly different political situation in that 1 year. The DOS plan, which was a banking plan, originated in the United States with our banking system. It was helping getting the reparation payments around, and people had money in their pockets again. And the Weimar government was having some success getting homeless people off the streets. And they were installing plumbing in public buildings, and kind of things were looking a little bit better for people. And the middle class was becoming a little bit content. And the Nazi Party itself was quite divided as to what they should do. And Hitler barely escaped deportation. But again, he had this goal that he would need about 5 years to easily ease into taking over the government. And He used his SS bodyguards to help him along the way. These were what were formerly members of the Freikorps, basically, in most cases. Heinrich Himmler, I read the most interesting chapter about him. It's in a book that's in our library. The SS Alibi of a Nation, 1922 to 1945. I was just trying to find some information to get into his head, because he was a rather odd duck. And this is a very good book about information that came out during the Nuremberg trials. I highly recommend it. And he joined the Nazi Party in 1923, and the Schutzstaffel, which is the SS, in 1925. And Hitler appointed him to be head of the SS in 1929. He was a Roman Catholic agricultural student from Bavaria, middle class. The middle class was quite discontent at this point in time because they were really down and out from reparations and everything. And but he was obsessed with racial selection. He's the one that came up with the going back 7 generations. If you had any Jewish blood, you couldn't become a member of the SS. You had to have a total background check and prove your ancestry to be a member of the SS. If someone in the SS married, they had to run everything by him in order to marry that person to make sure they didn't have any Jewish ancestry for 7 generations. He had kinds of crazy ideas, like women that had to work in the field should eat garlic and it would help them be able to work harder. And just kind of strange ideas in general. And he was viewed as an intellectual crank by many of his co-workers through his life, and widely ignored by most Germans, but he was really a monster, quite a monster. So we had the stock market crash in 1929, the world's in a turmoil, and Reed Smoot and Willis Hawley, 2 senators in the United States, decide that they're going to pass the Smoot-Hawley Act, and our President Hoover went along with it. And basically, the whole world is barely recovering from an economic crisis of World War I. And they decided they're going to have 20% tariffs on international trade, all international trade. And it was just an international outrage against us. And Hoover signed this thing. The upshot of it was, 1,000 economists urged Hoover to veto it, but he ignored them. It severely worsened the Great Depression in the United States, impacted the world all the way around, and again made it impossible for Germany to pay any of its debts, and their economy crashed again in a bad, bad way. And I had a professor once that said that he kind of blamed them totally for causing the rise of Hitler. Said it was basically, it was their fault. I heard that one time in the class. And then I've heard economists say he was the total reason for the Great Depression. They certainly weren't helpful. And they did give lots of ammunition to Hitler so that he could rise to power. And then, so Hitler comes to power in 1933. And the way he did it within the system. He got the legislature to vote. This established the power of the Nazi government to pass laws without the approval of Parliament. Think about that. Okay, this in turn nullified the Weimar Republic's constitution. And Hitler had succeeded in using the system to overthrow the Republic without a shot being fired. And he was now the chancellor, and hardly anybody had really been paying much attention to that. So my original question when I started looking into all this was, what was going on in Alsace-Lorraine? Well, Alsace-Lorraine was mostly German-speaking, They had rich iron ore deposits. And I have on notes here the exact percentages of who was living there. Basically, they had a very small German population, a Jewish population in Alsace-Lorraine. Most people, about 80%, were German-speaking. There were some Polish speakers. There were, and the rest were French speakers. They had changed hands a few times, and so most of the people who lived there were multilingual. They had to be. During World War I, they didn't really suffer a lot of on-the-ground infrastructure damage because Germany wanted them, and France wanted them. And they wanted them in one piece when it was all over. But they did have an incredible amount of stress living there with the changing of the guard all the time. Germany had acquired Alsace-Lorraine, had added Alsace-Lorraine to its empire after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, but they lost it with the Treaty of Versailles. They wanted it back. France, on the other hand, said that was our land. You shouldn't have taken it. We want it back. And so they both wanted it. Alsace-Lorraine had a rich iron ore resources that were very important to Germany. Had the biggest industrial complex. France did not. But France needed that iron ore in order to move along into the next century. So the French economy was kind of dependent on the iron ore resources of Alsace-Lorraine. The World War I conditions, as I said, there were constant changes in who was in charge. Throughout World War I, Germany placed more troops there than any other region in the German Empire. The French language was outlawed by Germans. You could be fined significant amounts of money for just saying bonjour if somebody heard you in the street as you were passing somebody. The German troops were occupying private homes. But then, every now and again, the French would invade a village and the Germans would have to leave, and now everybody had to speak French all of a sudden. And back and forth, and they would arrest anybody for speaking German. And as I said, the impact on the infrastructure there was some impact, but it was minimal compared to other places. So, the aftermath of World War I in France, they also had a problem with the fascist military units. They were scattered throughout France, much like the Freikorps. There were labor unions that the middle class controlled. They weren't like labor unions that we know today. They weren't really being extremely successful in getting workers' rights. The bourgeoisie of France fought change before, during, and after World War I. They wanted everything just the way it had been. And then there was a thing called the Dreyfus Affair. That exposed many of the anti-Semitic views of many Frenchmen. Dreyfus was wrongly, as most historians believe, accused of spying. He was convicted, and then later on someone else confessed to it, and he was exonerated. But everybody, a lot of people, if you were of the anti-Semitic tilt, you were not going to believe that he should have been exonerated. People took sides. So, as opposed to Alsace-Lorraine, the actual infrastructure in France had been totally destroyed. The livestock in France had been severely depleted. They were either killed or the Germans were taking them back to Germany. 1.5 million of the French forces were killed in action. 3.5 million veterans were severely disabled. The birth rate had dropped dramatically during the war because there were, no fathers around. And Germany was not complying with the reparations reparations agreements, so they had no cash coming in. And throughout this period, the politics moved from right to left without any clear goals in mind. I was amused when Dittmar referred to how many prime ministers France had before World War I. Well, it only got worse after World War I. There was actually one prime minister that lasted 3 days. So there was just no clear idea of which way they should go. There was such a fear of communism that people were leaning towards fascism in many cases. It was a parliamentary system, so they had to form coalitions. They basically were forming coalitions with people that they didn't agree with on many things. There were lots of different ideas. There were the revanchists who wanted to get Alsace-Lorraine back. There were the anti-clericals who wanted separation of church and state. There were veterans that wanted to get some kind of help from their injuries in World War I. It was just all over the map how they felt, and they had to form these coalitions. And so many parties, you'd almost lose track when you're reading about them, and their names never really accurately describe what they're up to. So I'll introduce you to a couple of the people involved here. Did my battery die? Back up. Hold on, that here. Help me well. I'm on that, we want to get to that. None of the buttons are working. What about this? Yeah, I'm going to that. There we go. I'll do it that way. Okay. So George Clements we met him a few minutes ago when we were talking about the Treaty of Versailles. And he started as prime minister for a while, and off and on. Many of these guys were in power 3 or 4 times, and then somebody else was in charge. And he opposed the anti-Semitic campaigns that supported Dreyfus, which made him, if you were Jewish, you were happy with him, and if you were an anti-Semitic type of a person, you were not happy with him. But he ordered a lot of repressive policies toward the workers, and he opposed suffrage, and he really wasn't very pro-worker. So he was not exactly, he was the sort of guy that would continually come to power, and then people would be disagreeing with what he was doing. Next guy that was a prominent politician in France at this time, he was a World War I pacifist, a member of the French Section of Workers and French Section of Workers International during the war. He was a fascist sympathizer and sought appeasement with the Axis powers. And he joined the conservative government of don't speak French, Dumerkel government after the 1934 Veterans Riot, which I'll get to in a minute. And he later joined the Vichy government and sent many Frenchmen to concentration camps. He was tried and executed after World War II. Like, all these guys really didn't like having to work with one another. That's the conclusion I came out to. This is Pétain, which I think is kind of famous because he wound up leading the Vichy government when that came into being. And he was a war hero in World War I, and he famously led the French troops through the WWI. And after the war, he campaigned relentlessly for an increase in the size of the French military. His basically was, the Germans are getting ahead of us, and we're getting behind. we need to do something about it. So far, so good. And then when Hitler came to power in 1933, he quickly switched to a position of appeasement, because he kind of viewed it as there's no way we can beat the Germans, we're not prepared to beat them, we need to just go along with them and do whatever they want. And being that kind of a guy, the Germans quickly appointed him to head the Vichy government, which was a rump state government that really had no power and was German controlled. So after the war, he was convicted of treason and died in prison. So this is another guy, a little on the mellow side, and he served as prime minister 11 times between World War I and World War II. He was prime minister 11 times in a 20-year period, along with a bunch of other people that were prime minister for 5 times, 3 times, 3 days, different things like that. And he shared the 1926 Nobel Prize for Peace with the German minister Gustav Stresemann for his World War I reconciliation efforts. Again, it was appeasement. And he attempted to establish a European Union in 1929. He was kind of an idealist and a little on the naive side, and his efforts were compromised by all kinds of nationalistic movements going on around him, the revanchists who wanted their land back, the fascist ideas that were beginning to come to the head in France. And he also had a very idealistic view of German intentions. He really felt that they were honest brokers. Edward Harriet, he's a guy kind of in the center of things. He was not a fascist, and he was not a communist, and he really was trying always to build coalitions. And his party is called the Radical Party because they were centrists. So the names of these parties never make sense to me. His coalition was called the Cartel des Gauches. I hope I said that in some kind of reasonable close proximity. And it was a moderate socialist coalition. And he led opposition to the post-war right-wing coalition known as the Bloc National. Now, the Bloc National was a middle-class coalition of people who really wanted things to just be sort of the way they were once upon a time. They really leaned more towards fascism than anything. There was quite a fear all around the world of the communists and what they were up to. And people kind of went to the total other end of the spectrum, to the fascists. It was happening everywhere. In 1942, he eventually led a protest against the appointment of Pétain to the Vichy government. And for that, he was deported to Germany for opposing the appointment of Pétain. And he was rescued by the Soviets in 1945. Another guy that was a little more on the mellow side, he was a Jewish person, a pacifist from Alsace-Lorraine. And he was the maker of the modern French Socialist Party. And he was working towards solidarity between the socialists, the radicals, and all other opponents of fascism in a coalition defined as the Popular Front. And he was very much anti-communist. So he's anti-fascist, anti-communist, he's in the middle. The middle wasn't doing very well in politics at this point in time. In 1940, the Vichy government accused him of war guilt. They decided to bring that up. They didn't blame for war guilt, and they were going to blame him for war guilt. Now, this guy was interesting. This is Gaston de Bergeville, or I don't know. Please help me later on how to pronounce some of these things. He was a radical Republican who was very popular. Everybody liked him. He sort of would, you get the feeling when you were talking to this guy that he was on your side. He served as president of France on and off from 1924 to 1931. And while his politics was generally center-left in the early years, he veered to center-right in later life. And He took the position of council president in 1934 with the intent to form a government of national unity. Now, 1934 was a critical year because something really bad happened. People were becoming very, very upset with these people that were in the middle ground of things. And there was a guy named Stavisky, which you may or may not have heard of, but he was a crook. He had pawn shop type things in Paris, where he claimed to have emeralds that had belonged to an empress. They turned out to be green glass. And he was in cahoots with many people in the center-left government. And they were then accused of covering up what he was up to. He was arrested many times and he always got off the hook. And there was a fraud trial that began in 1927, but bail was granted 19 times. Somebody always intervened for him. In the middle of all of that, a judge that was to be hearing this case was found decapitated. So this is a scandal that's going on in France, and the Central Party is attached to it because some of the people that were center people were supporting Stavisky and getting him out of jail all the time. The far-right military, paramilitaries, which would be the fascist end, were outraged by all of this and just kept blowing up. And lo and behold, they had this thing called the Veterans Riot on the 6th of February 1934. This was kind of a call for all the oppressed people to come to Paris and invade the capital and take over the assembly and change everything that way through violence. And the far-right fascists really outnumbered the people that came from the communist side of the spectrum. The communists stayed on the other side of the bridge, on the other side of the Seine, because they didn't want to they knew they'd get into a shooting match if they were with the same group. So they kind of separated themselves by the river. But unfortunately, the riot got so out of hand that the police wound up killing. Now, some sources told me 15 demonstrators and some said 17. I think what happened was some of the injured died thereafter. Nonetheless, at least 15 people died, probably 17. And many people were shot and injured. There were projectiles flying all over the place. 2,000 people were injured. This disturbance went on until 2:30 a.m. So they never got inside the assembly, but guess what's going on inside the assembly? There was an absolute brawl inside the assembly. All the different parties just started punching one another, knocking each other down, throwing them across the room. A lot of injuries inside the assembly building. And the cartel des gauches, that's the Center Party, got blamed for allowing the police to shoot the unarmed veterans. And the leftists tried to rally around Edward Daladier, who is now president, and they were trying to restore some kind of order by rallying around the president. Edward Daladier winds up being in office for only 3 days. The judiciary was unwilling to intervene and make any rulings regarding the situation. So the aftermath of this riot was that Daladier winds up resigning after 3 days, as I said. He had fought on the Western Front. He had wanted some kind of unity. Yet as prime minister, he signed the Munich Agreement later on in 1938, thinking he could work with the Germans and appease them. And he was a liberal who expanded the French welfare state. And after the fall of France, he was tried for treason by the Vichy government and sent to Buchenwald. So, in the aftermath, the left view of the riot as an attempted coup of the center-left government and as an overt fascist conspiracy. And the right view of the riot as a natural outcome of the general discontent of the center-left over the Stavisky affair and the economy. And in subsequent years, the far right grew in strength as fascism became more and more acceptable to people, and appeasement became the dominant strategy that culminated with the Munich Agreement in 1939. And on July 10, 1940, the Germans invaded France, and an armistice was signed on the 22nd of June, and then the 10th of July, the Vichy government was installed. And basically, we were on the path of no return at that point. And that's all I have to say for today.